Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are in the world, which seems to be everywhere in the world, to our wonderful participants. Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final webinar in our four-part short course series on cyber defense strategies, mentored by the wonderful George Thomas with IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. My name is Jack Stewart, and I will be, as usual, your MC for today. We also have the honour and privilege of being joined by the wonderful Tim Dillon as a co-host / co-mentor today. Tim Dillon has over 20 years experience in cybersecurity and is currently working as the NCC Group's Asia Pacific Regional Director and heads up NCC Group's professional services security as well. So Tim will be joining us and we'll get a proper introduction from George partway through the webinar. But we have Tim's wealth of knowledge to mine today as well as George. As usual, we are broadcasting to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. IT Masters pays respect to elders and ancestors and acknowledges their ongoing sovereignty over these lands, waters, and their culture. So, without further ado, some further ado, just a little bit of housekeeping as usual. We've got a chat section and a Q&A section. The chat section is for comments or interactions with other participants, things that you'd like everybody to see. And the Q&A section is for questions for the mentor that are directly about the course content. It would be great, given the volume of questions that we've been receiving through this short course, which is fantastic. It would be fantastic, again, to see if we could keep the questions brief as possible, try and be as succinct as possible so we can get through as many as we can. As usual, we are not going to be able to answer every single question, but you are able to head to the forums at learn.itmasters.edu.au, where you'll be able to discuss your questions with other participants, as well as George, potentially Tim as well. We'll see if you're very lucky and ask a fantastic question, I suppose. And that is also where you can access all of the course materials, the readings, the lecture recordings, any additional materials, as well as those forums can all be found at learn.itmasters.edu.au. And the exam for this short course will be available from Monday onwards. So it's a couple of days away. You've got a few days to study before that becomes available. But that is the time that we have for this. So now, without further ado, hello and welcome to the wonderful George Thomas, our mentor for today. George, take it away.
Thanks so much. I have tonsillitis, so as far as I know. So I've kind of bumped up on the painkillers, so hopefully they hold out. Welcome back to the final week. Today, module 4, week 4, and we are going to talk about implementation, budgets, funding, ROI, all that sort of fun stuff. So basically, we talked in previous weeks about some more of the program development aspects, some of the risk assessment aspects around, things like selection of controls. And now it comes time to, I guess, try and get some funding or maybe justify some funding, depending. And then looking at things like the implementation, some of the change management stuff. And then finally, a bit of a touch on some of the reporting. So when I talk about the ROI aspect, looking at some of those measurement elements and how to measure and validate sort of the effectiveness of the program that you've implemented. And I think, look, that's probably a key thing that I've asked Tim to come and join us for today is around that. I'll give it a bit of introduction in a second, but I think he will provide a lot of insight and he can share some of his knowledge in some of those areas. So in terms of the agenda, pretty simple. First one is building a business case. So followed by implementation and change management, and then the measurement and monitoring aspect. As we've said a few times, we have a special guest. I'm not going to read this out, but I am going to invite Tim maybe just to give a bit of an introduction of himself and what he does, and maybe what I guess NCC does for anyone that's not familiar with NCC, and then it might all make sense as to where this is going. So Tim, if you're able to just jump off mute and do a quick intro, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm off mute. I was trying to share my camera. For some reason, that's not working.
This is your line of work. You're always hiding in the shadows.
That's strange. You can't start video because your host has stopped it. Well, happy to jump on video if you can enable it for me. Otherwise, yes, as said, I'm the Regional Director for Professional Services for APAC. NCC Group. NCC Group is a global organization headquartered in Manchester. We have around 1,300, 1,400 consultants. We're in all parts of the world, 34 countries, and we focus on end-to-end cybersecurity. So from managed services, so security monitoring, through to incident response, and on the professional services side of things, your governance, risk, compliance, assurance testing. So think of things like ethical hacking, penetration testing, or these more recent terms, red teaming, and we can talk about that if you're not familiar with what that is, and purple teaming, and even gold teaming. There's terms being thrown around these days like pink teaming and all the colors. It's very exciting, but they all mean something to someone. So we can talk through some of these things.
I've got a slide on that. I only included 3, so feel free to include all those other colors of the rainbow.
Yes, it is. We actually called that division that does the red team, black team, gold team, the full spectrum attack simulation division, just as a bit of a play on the different colors.
That's me. Well, thanks for that introduction. Apparently your camera works now. Oh, there you are. Hello.
Yep, sorry.
So we'll carry on, but also there are some questions in there, and I think that one that is there down the bottom, which we'll get to questions later, but don't clear it, please. I think that might have been one of the ones from last week that I was asking to come back to this week, just kind of save for you. So if you can see the questions, but I'll keep going. I'll start with the building a business case piece, and as I said, we'll keep stepping through, but feel free to add anything in if you've got anything that would be kind of broaden my knowledge, I guess, and everybody else's. That'll be fantastic. So yeah, feel free to chime in whenever you feel like it. So building a business case. So a business case is likely a requirement, and I say that because I've done so many of them now that I can almost do them while sleeping. Not quite, but many organizations will do so many of these that they have a business case template or format that needs to be followed. Otherwise, I guess there are plenty of sort of free resources out there to get examples of business cases. But at a fundamental level, what a business case is, it sounds kind of maybe a little bit straightforward, but it's basically a document that demonstrates why a particular project is needed. In this instance, why a particular project is needed, and then it's submitted for approval, usually to board, senior management, someone that is authorized to approve it. And there are varied criteria as to when a business case may be needed. I mean, sometimes one may be needed, sometimes maybe it's not, and that is usually organization dependent. So, for example, in organizations that I've been in, if it exceeded the budget, it needed a business case. Even if it was in the budget, it needed a business case, but maybe it exceeded some sort of threshold. So, for example, say there was a, I don't know, 250K put aside for a cyber project, but there's a threshold of if it went over $99,999, then a business case was required. That would be an example of a threshold. Another one is that it is not in the budget/plan, But as I said, this is organization dependent. And I think one of the key things that we will probably need to think about when putting together a business case, and this is kind of underlying message that I seem to find comes up a lot, is, the whole, when I say why do we, as in, the organization, like, why do we care? Why do we care about this? And so that's the message that I like to try and send it through that process is, it's all great to put together something that's fantastic, that kind of says, oh, this is how much it's going to cost, this is how long it's going to take, this is what it is, and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, you need to justify why it matters. And so I'm going to break this down into a few sections. Once again, this is not prescriptive. You can use this. You probably, as I said, many organizations have their own formatting, but these are, sort of very kind of common sections that may appear in a business case. And so we're going to step through each of these in a little bit more detail. But, executive summary, I put tip right this last. I find a lot of folks that haven't written well, actually, I find a lot of folks that haven't written an executive summary before tend to write it first. And I would argue it's kind of hard to summarize a paper if you haven't written it yet. So write that bit last, make your life a lot easier. And then, introduction, objectives, have you looked at alternatives, market analysis. I'm not going to bother reading these because we're going to step through them anyway as we go through each of these slides. So introduction. So provide some background into the issue problem that you're trying to solve with the proposal. You need to summarize any useful background information, e.g. a current high profile incident, but make sure it's relevant. So for example, you might not want to call out the latitude breach, for example, if you don't collect consumer PI. It's probably less relevant. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but it's probably going to have less impact than something that's more relevant. And I'm going to use an example of one that I used. So several years ago, I was CISO at a law firm, and when WannaCry first came through, and I don't know if I should be, it's all public information, right? Another law firm was a victim of ransomware. And as a result, and people probably sitting there either frantically Googling or know who I'm talking about, but this other firm, global firm, was basically crippled for, I think, about 3 weeks. And so what that meant is, okay, it was a current event at the time, and it was very high profile. It was very relevant. And so I used that as an example of what happens when things potentially go wrong. And so that actually really helped that business case get across the line. It actually did. And it was initially to do the implementation of the, at the time, the ASD Essential 8, including the application whitelisting piece, and got like funding for it, and happy days. So something like that is really, really helpful if you can find it. So that's the first thing. Have a nice, clear, concise introduction, and then look at some of the objectives. So what are the goals of the project? That's going to be things like to prevent this from happening, and to protect this, and to ensure this. So protect things like reputation, and prevent operational impact, and all that sort of fun stuff that we try and do as part of cyber defense programs and things like that. But I think a key thing, especially coming, when you're placing this in front of a board, is to make sure there's alignment with strategic goals of the organization. So make sure that they align, because then it's again easier to justify when it meets what the board is trying to achieve. So, you definitely don't want to conflict that, because that's going to create problems. So there's a lot of bits and pieces that kind of have to go on when you're putting these things together. I think the very, very first one that I did, I just went, okay, I want to go and get SEAM. All right, this is SEAM. It's good because of all these things. And I just sounded like a marketing person, even though I was obviously internal resource. And it was kind of like, yeah, nah, like, but it's really, really good. And so, to get that point across, you really have to kind of lay that kind of almost business talk in there and make sure that you're conveying those points across, that you're aligning it with, you know, the market, and that it's relatable. And, you know, it's that thing where always, you know, what am I going to get out of it? As in from the board's perspective, what are they going to get out of it? Does it mean they, you know, don't go to jail, or does it mean that they don't suffer, like, you know, or sorry, I shouldn't say that. Does it mean that they reduce the risk of them going to jail, or reduce the risk of substantial penalties? You know, what is actually the benefit of doing this, and make it clear that, and articulate that to them. Alternatives, you have to look at what other options there are. You can't just say, I've decided that we should do this and the end, because you're going to likely get asked, well, what other options have you considered? And why are you not proposing option B? You know, is it less effective? Does it cost more? And certainly I've done that before, where I've looked at it and gone, yeah, this is option B, and I've done, you know, A, B, C, and D. And, you know, pick option C, but, you know, option A, well, sorry, you know, pick option C, but pick option A. Option B is, you know, really expensive. And then, you know, option C is less expensive, but not very effective, you know, just those sorts of things. So just make sure that you do those exercises. It can always be a little bit kind of, you know, annoying though, having to go, you know, meet with vendors and so forth. And I feel like I might have even done this to Tim at some point. You know, where you're not really sure what your budget looks like at this stage, and you've got to get someone to put together a proposal and send it to you, and you kind of feel bad because, you know, they had to do work, and then you're like, I don't even know if this is going across the line yet. But yeah, that unfortunately, that's something that needs to happen, because, you know, usually the authorizers are going to want to see that you've taken a good wide view of it, and you're proposing multiple options. And then look at the market. So, you know, and when I say that, this is where I start to look at what helps to drive the need. So, are there compliance requirements? I find that compliance requirements are a very good way to get a project across the line, because if it's legislated, or it's a regulatory requirement, or if it's a contract requirement, which kind of is that second one there, but if it's a significant enough contract requirement, then that is most likely a good justification for getting across the line. In fact, I've seen, you know, where in some project teams, they kind of assess, I guess, the priority of a project, and when they have compliance requirements, there can be like a multiplier that basically says, okay, this automatically gets bumped up to a high priority project because it solves a regulatory requirement. So identify that stuff, you know. Yeah, Privacy Act is probably a key one. And then with privacy reforms, that's probably going to become, you know, take a bit more of a front seat with, you know, some of those additional requirements from those reforms. Sorry for those folks in Australia, Privacy Act reforms. But yeah, likewise in other jurisdictions where there are even already more stringent privacy laws, there's likely to be some sort of impact for anyone that deals with consumer personal information. But then obviously there's still other things as well, like, you know, proprietary information that depending on what industry you're in, that may be subject to some sort of requirements. Is there any client or customer demand? So can your clients and customers demanding that you have these controls in place be used as part of your argument for getting these controls in place? And I've had that happen as well. So, you know, I've done business cases before where, you know, a client said, well, you know, you've got to have, I don't know, what was it? It was a patch management thing, right? You have to have patch management that was within the like sort of 48-hour kind of period. And while we'd already done a patch management project to implement some tooling, this was probably more around getting a better tool that could roll patches out more efficiently. And so this was a few years ago as well, but having that demand helped to kind of drive that. And then the other one, you know, what are your peers and competitors doing? And so, yeah, I did use that example before with that other law firm. I mean, that's obviously their misfortune was kind of our fortune. But what does the market do? Because that's also a question I've been asked a lot. Well, what is this other place doing? They're the same as us. Are they this mature? What I often find out, which is kind of annoying, is a lot of the time they're not, which I don't think is a very good excuse, right? Just because they're not doing it. Maybe they're having the same conversations over there. Well, what are they doing? So yeah, that could be a bit frustrating. The other one, which I didn't, well, sorry, that's not in market analysis. I was going to say we'll come back to the testing stuff in a minute. But yeah, that's usually where I start with that. And then the important stuff, right? The accounting folks, they want to know what's it going to cost. And don't forget to include things like additional costs. So support, maintenance, implementation. Hey, when the renewal happens, what's that going to cost? Because sometimes, there might be a question around that. Maybe it's too early to tell, and that can just be, potentially estimated. But yeah, and then also, is it in the budget? So is there a budget item for this? That's usually another thing that kind of pops in. All right. And then simple, a bit different from the other risk assessments that we've talked about in the past. This is project risks. So what are the project risks? What are the potential side effects of the implementation? For example, let's look at the ACSC Essential 8. App control, for example, would mean that there's an approval process that is needed to approve any new executables or software, scripts, whatever. And that would potentially slow things down. So that might have some productivity impacts. But in addition to that, that would require additional resources, maybe, to do the approvals, depending on how it's set up. So I think it's important here again to articulate and reinforce that risk first benefit, right? So this is why this is important. Yeah, there's risks to doing this, but it's important to do this because blah. So yeah, these are always fun to write. And then implementation plan. So this should be things like timelines, resourcing, key milestones, all the project planning type stuff. Estimated time for completion, because that often comes up too. When do we go, okay, this all sounds great. When can we have it? Oh, by the way, I remember what it was now. It was ISO. It wasn't patch management. It was ISO. It was implementing ISO 27001. Because obviously, 5, 6, 7 years ago, it's like, why don't we do this? And it's because it would make your life easier. It'll make life easier because there's assurance and customers want it. And we will talk about that. There's a slide a little bit later on some assurance type activities. Anyway, sorry, estimated time for completion. Talked about that. Yeah, when can we have it? And then I'm sure that you'll get held to that too. So be realistic when doing that. So, yeah. Cool. And then what will the project help mitigate? So, it's unlikely to solve, I guess, completely solve something in the context of cyber. We know that we can't get risk to zero. So, but, rather what will it reduce? So what risk will it reduce, and potentially what impact will it reduce? So, perhaps say this is what it is now, and then post-project, this is what it looks like. That is definitely a benefit. So, highlight those benefits, highlight what is going to happen after this project is completed. And then make a recommendation. So, make a final recommendation to complete the business case. It can be multiple recommendations. So yeah, there was options A, B, C, and D. You could take a couple of those and say, well, here's A, this is preferred. And then, C is our next preferred option, just in case. So yeah, that's that can be done as well. So you can make those recommendations at the end. And so all in all, I mean, this is the business case stuff. This is not meant to be, I haven't certainly not done a business case that is a novel. It is fairly high level. There's not a lot of detailed stuff in here. It's meant to be, something that typically gets tabled, especially if it's a large item, might get tabled at a board meeting. Like, we're not going to really have time to sit there and read through, pages and pages and pages of stuff. So yeah, keep these fairly high level, to the point, make them clear. That's usually where I start with that. So, okay. I think I'm going to pause there because we've got implementation and change, and then maybe we'll chuck a couple of questions that popped up.
We do have a couple of questions that
I need a drink.
popped up. Excellent. Well, I'll read out some of the questions while you take a drink. Tajari has asked, who is responsible for preparing the market analysis, financial analysis, and risk assessment for a particular organization? Which sounds like it might be organizationally dependent, but do you have any insights if there are patterns that tend to happen?
It is organizationally dependent. I've had to do them before. I'm going to say that I don't think there's a clear cut. This is the person responsible for that, unless it's something that is in a charter somewhere in an organization. In organizations that I've been in, either I've done them or we've had a business analyst be like, or potentially a project specific person, but generally a BA, so a business analyst that has been responsible for gathering and collating that information and then working with various stakeholders, whether it be, you know, me as a project lead or with finance to pull some numbers or who knows what. So I find for those bigger, more complex projects, a BA, but yeah, it is organization dependent.
Thank you, George. Got a question asking, how do you do market analysis about competitors and how will you know what is happening in their organization?
Yeah, so I don't know if it was just the industry I was in, but I just asked them. So a lot of the time, you know, I'd go to industry peer events and I'd make relationships with basically competitors. Like, I think we're all fighting the same fight, right? Even though we compete and try and get, you know, clients and potentially each other's clients, at the end of the day, we don't want either of us to get breached. So I find there tends to be a lot of sort of cooperation and knowledge sharing and a lot of willingness to share. So a lot of those, you know, there's like, I know there's like LinkedIn forums. I know that, as I said, I know that there's a lot of sort of groups that kind of meet regularly, like industry type groups. When I say industry, like there might be just a specific small group that meets of a bunch of, you know, security managers from the same industry, sometimes even different industries, but maybe there's a few overlaps. So it's really about, it's like, for me, I've always found a combination of, you know, of using networks has really kind of helped. That's what I've found. Yeah, like just Googling it, I find it's going to be pretty tough unless it's perhaps maybe a company that more publicly states what they do. You know, some of the larger organizations or public organizations might say, hey, this is what some of the stuff that we do. It'll still be a bit vague, but you can kind of get a feel for it. Whereas, yeah, I've just typically leveraged contacts that I've had and people I know that, you know, are in the same industry and ask them the question.
Great, thank you. We have had a request for a little bit more information about aligning business objectives, but it does come with an apology for your voice. So feel free to refuse to say more about aligning business objectives if that is your prerogative.
No, that's a good question. So in terms of business objectives, so organizations will typically make some sort of objective statements about their organization. So their organization might say something like, and we saw this in the short case study that I popped up. What was that, weeks sort of 1 and 2? Was it 2 and 3? 2 and 3, where there was some objectives there, some strategic objectives around, you know, being the most, I can't remember what it was, being the most trusted bank, or you know, something like that, right? So, but there was something around that. So, for example, an objective might be to ensure that there is, you know, consumer confidence and protect their reputation against, you know, whatever. So if you can somehow, that's the like worst objective ever, sorry. But if you can align that with what you're doing, that's valuable. So, you know, if you're saying that what this project does can help this outcome, this business goal, then that makes it a better argument. That's kind of what I'm getting at there. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. We've got a few more questions coming in that do seem quite related to implementation and change management. So perhaps we will move on to the next section, and then we can get to potentially those questions will be answered in this section. And if not, then we'll do some more Q&A after that.
Awesome. All right. Oh, what did I just do? Okay, sorry. All right, so you've done your business case. You got it approved. Congratulations. Awesome. You've selected, and probably as part of this business case, you probably selected a vendor product. You may not have. You may have gone more broad and said, oh, we want to implement sync or app whitelisting. But let's say, the next thing was you got it approved. You've selected a vendor, a product, etc. Perhaps you just had to get 3 quotes, or perhaps you went through a whole RFP process. We're not going to go through that. Anyway, now there's the whole implementation phase. And this is, for me, this is kind of sharing more of the lessons learned, having implemented a lot of the projects that involve change. Often to folks that kind of weren't very keen on the change. And I'm going to say, the first time I did this, I messed up. Like, I got it completely wrong. I didn't completely break anything, but there was some pretty annoyed people. So yeah, I just thought I'd share some of what happened. Maybe not that specific scenario, but what I learned from that. So I think the first thing was, and it's some key steps that I've kind of identified here. By the way, this isn't out of anywhere specific. This is just kind of what I've sort of culminated over very many years. And I'm going to break into these in a bit more detail again. So communication, change management plan, engagement, training, leadership support, and managing resistance. Like I said, no point reading those out because we're going to get into it in a bit more detail. And so communications. See, the first thing is, which I learned, if you don't tell anybody and something changes, they tend to not be very happy, especially when they notice it and it's happened to them. Actually, I'm going to tell what it was. So this was, hang on, this was 2008. New manager, right? So I was in a new role. I'd always been in, more technical roles where I was like an engineer, architect, and I moved into my first management role. Yay me. And I thought, yep, we'll sort out this security stuff, and and the first thing was let's kind of lock down the desktop a bit. And this is, to me at the time, I thought this was fairly trivial, but now looking back, I'm like, oh, yeah, I can see what people got annoyed about this. I don't know if anyone knows what I did. I'm about to tell you. I locked down I'm seeing if anyone's trying to guess, but I locked down the wallpaper on the desktop to like the corporate wallpaper. That's exactly what I did. So people who had, and I feel a little bit bad about it now, people like photos of their kids and their dog, and it was like, gone, company logo. Oh man, that went down like a lead balloon. Who's this new guy? And he's taken away all our wallpaper freedoms. And so that happened. Now it's pretty normal. I don't think I've had a customized wall. Maybe I was just leading edge. I don't think I've had a customized wallpaper for, oh my God, yeah, at least a decade. Honestly, at least since then. But that was the first thing I did. And look, to me, that was very, very, very poor change management because, yeah, I just didn't tell anybody. We just did it. I got the team to do it. They did it. It worked. Happy days for about 5 seconds. And so when you think about it, seems a little bit silly, but that was my first lesson. And so when it comes to implementing changes, should have communicated that. So what are we changing? Why are we changing it? So why are we doing this? When is it going to happen? How will it affect you? And if you've got any issues, who do you contact? And so evidently, if you just go straight back into Paint and just go because you also remove the right click properties thing, so you couldn't go in there and set it back. But I know if you could just go into Paint at the time, I think it was like Windows 7, you could just like open a picture in Paint and go set as wallpaper, and that worked anyway. But it would revert back after a reboot or whatever. But anyway, when group policy updated, but whatever. Anyway, so clear communications is key, and they need to be easy and understandable. You know, I'm actually sitting here thinking now, I was like, why are we doing this? Why am I getting rid of wallpaper? But you know, there are all sorts of reasons why you might want to get rid of wallpaper. But yeah, making sure that that is clear, that it is communicated, and that, you know, there's a sort of, you know, valid reason behind doing it. Well, at least, you know, valid to you, valid and that makes sense is important. Otherwise, yeah, if you don't tell anybody and just do it, usually goes down like a lead balloon. So yeah, that was my first lesson. Second one was change management. So probably had I done change, I mean, this could apply to the same situation. Had I done this, that probably wouldn't have happened either, because I would have carefully thought out what I was doing, identified who I was going to affect, and you know, go from there. But first thing is, you know, planning out that implementation thoroughly and carefully. So who are the stakeholders? I like to think of like, who are the people that are going to make the most noise? In this case, it wasn't everybody, but it was quite a few. And then, you know, what are the resources? What are the, you know, who are the resources that I need for this change? Because sometimes you also need to get folks outside of, you know, your teams, and that's often the case. And so you don't want to get them offside either. And so that's important. Also, you know, how is success measured? So what makes this a successful change? And then how are you going to deal with those issues and those resistance issues? And you'll probably see that there is resistance mentioned in here a few times. And then what will you do if something goes wrong? Like what's your rollback plan sort of thing? As I put here, you probably need to do most of this for a change request anyway. So, you know, you kind of got to do this work regardless. And then, you know, should a phased approach be considered? I find that phased approaches can also help rather than, and so at that time that I did this, it wasn't just wallpaper. That was the one that people kind of really had that, you know, really upset about. But wallpaper was gone. Everyone had local admin rights. That was also gone. What else disappeared? There was a few things that disappeared and that stopped working when this change went through. But I guess the question is, could there have been a phased approach? Could I have removed admin rights and then taken away wallpaper after, or whatnot? And I think that, I mean, that's obviously a very archaic example from in terms of some of the more basic stuff. I mean, local admin rights, I think hopefully in many organizations is gone now as the default image, basically. But I'm sure Tim loves it when people have local admin rights. Just looking at internet there. Makes it too easy though, doesn't it? But yeah, is there a phased approach? So like, you know, looking at something like the ACSC Essential 8, you know, you might not just, you know, do big bang and roll out the whole thing. You'd start somewhere, even as an element of that, you know, we talk about app control, you know, do you roll out app control, but only, you know, have it in kind of monitoring prompting mode versus do you have it in blocking and then do you move to blocking? Same thing with data leakage prevention projects. Like you don't just go, okay, we're going to install it and it's just going to stop everything from going, because that's going to end up with all sorts of chaos too. So is there a phased approach? You know, do you start with agent goes on, we monitor, okay, agent goes on, we monitor, we prompt and say, hey, by the way, should you be sending this? And then, okay, now we're going to start blocking stuff. So consider things like that. Now, talking about those stakeholders, engaging your key stakeholders. So identify champions. So when I've done this, I have started to identify key folks within the business that I knew were probably going to be impacted the most. And then I'd say, hey, do you want to be involved in this project? Because then I'd like to get your feedback. And by getting their feedback and by basically turning them into champions, and they would talk to others within the business, it made my life so much easier. And so I do things like small pilots. I'd get a pilot of, you know, say this organization I'm talking about, different one now, had 1,600 staff. I'd get a pilot of about 50 from around the business, and they were technical and non-technical folks, right? So there were people that didn't, you know, they, I couldn't get them to, I couldn't explain all the tech to them and they'd understand me. It was more a case of, I'm putting, just a normal user in there and saying, okay, well, how's it going for you, sort of thing. And they would come back, and if they had issues, but we'd iron those issues out during that pilot phase before rolling out to the public. I say public as in the broad user set. And as a result, that meant that, there was a lot less resistance. It also meant, because a lot of those folks talked, that they would spread the word, say, oh, this is coming, and, we've been working on it. And so they would help kind of, promote it for me. So that worked out really, really well. So that is a key one. That was an initiative that I did back then, and I thought that was really, really effective. And then training, ensure that there's adequate training available, ensure that support is easy to access, and, as I said, consider champions or super users who can help. I'm going to just quickly say, short training is better. The last thing you want is long training for people that might not even want something in the first place, because it might negatively impact their job somehow. But, if you can kind of handhold them through the quote journey, that I find that really, really, really helpful. So, yeah, training. And leadership support. So ensure that senior leadership support the project. I mean, in theory, hey, they signed the business case, so they should be supporting it, but make sure they've got buy-in as well. And so, because often even some of the loudest messages of dissatisfaction, at least I've noticed, can come from here. And so if leadership are on board, then that helps overcome that, but it also helps increase adoption and overcome some of that resistance. So yeah, that's a really good way to help drive the buy-in as well. Last one on this, which is managing the resistance. As I said, and I've said this about 3 or 4 times now, make sure that you can identify those people and the stakeholders, or our stakeholders, that are likely to be resistant. That's not very good grammar. Be resistant. And so involve them in planning and decisions if you can, because if you involve them, then that helps get them on board, and then they'll help advocate for you rather than fighting them. And then, yeah, ensure that there's support for any issues that is easily available. So, all right. Next, questions.
We've got plenty of questions, and Tim in the background, by the way, is quietly typing answers to several of these questions, which is really helping the efficiency with which we can work through them.
Can everybody see the questions?
No, participants can only see questions that have been answered.
Oh, no, that's what I mean. So if Tim answers, everybody can see the answer that Tim put.
I believe so, yes. So thank you very much for that, Tim. Justin has asked, George, you seemed uncomfortable reaching out to vendors to get detailed into the business case. Was there any reason for this? Are they such a bad thing? RFT, are they such a bad thing?
It's not about, so it's not about being uncomfortable. That made me, I sounded uncomfortable when I said that. It's not about being uncomfortable. It's the fact that, a lot of these proposals and RFPs are very, I guess, large and require a lot of effort. So you're asking someone to take a lot of time and effort to, and when I say not RFPs, because obviously everyone's got an equal playing field. Everyone's got a chance to pitch. But like, I think I was not so much talking about RFPs, but like, when just asking for like a quote. So sometimes, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but I've been in situations before where I feel like sometimes quotes are just being asked for the sake of asking for quotes just so that you got 3. Having said that, if it's the best deal, you're probably going to take it. So maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't for nothing. But as I said, one of the key things is sometimes you'll ask for that, and you're asking for it as part of a proposal that you don't know if it's going to get through. And so you're asking someone to take do some work and take time out of their day to do that. I guess that's just the nature of the business. But I just feel not uncomfortable, but I just worry about some of that sometimes, because I'm like, okay, there's only so many favors you can ask. That's kind of more what it is. It's not that I don't do it or that I think anyone shouldn't do it. It's just that, you're asking for something when you don't really know I like to know where things are going. I guess that's just me. So maybe that's what makes me a little bit comfortable about it. But I do it anyway because you have to.
Thank you very much. We've also got a question asking, how would you sell the need for faster implementation of changes to engineers who are not software people? Big issues with lack of skilled workers is engineers in different fields are in roles they don't understand.
That sounds like a bigger problem.
It does. It might be a personnel issue potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that one. Engineers in different fields in roles they don't understand. Yeah, that definitely sounds like a larger problem than this. And I guess what I'm trying to ascertain here, faster implementation. But it sounds like if they're in the fields and roles that they don't understand, that there's no way they could do the changes faster anyway. So that's yeah, I think that sounds like a bigger issue where that would go back to potentially like board level to say we can't do these changes fast enough because we don't have the skills to do this, and then that needs to be dealt with at a personnel level. I don't think that, or are you saying sell that? No, it says changes to engineers, so you're not selling it to the board. Okay. Yeah,
No,
I feel like that's a different problem.
I was going to say, I think that issue might be answered by discuss with the board and / or HR, unfortunately. A question about legislation, though. Yash has asked, when we have to consider legislation if the organization is MNC, what legislation do we have to consider? Do we have to write separate case studies for each country?
Assuming MNC, multinational corp. So when we consider legislation in organizations multinational, what legislation do we have to consider? Okay, so that's a lawyer question. Did work in law firm, not lawyer. Do review legal contracts, but for lawyers to then give back to them for them to for suppliers and stuff. But what we consider legislation in multinational. So generally, I'm going to say, and not legal advice, is that you would consider the legislation in the countries that you operate in. So for example, and who you provide services to. So for example, if you operate in Australia, then you're going to need to consider legislation that's Australian, e.g. Privacy Act type stuff, right? Or if you provide services to the EU, then GDPR is going to be a consideration. So I'm always going to look at it from that lens, and I wouldn't say that you would, if it's a centralized, so when you say do you have to write a separate case study for each project, once again, organization dependent. If you've got a centralized function and it's going to go up to one line of approval, then you might, I wouldn't have thought, unless there was a requirement for this, that you would do a separate case study. But what you would do is you would call out each of those pieces of legislation and how that is addressed by this project, perhaps in one document. That's how it would cover that. But yeah, I think if I was doing this, I would consider legislation in all the countries that were relevant, so that I operated in.
I would agree with that. Privacy Act specifically says, I know because I had to do this the other day. Let's say the updates they're proposed. The organization or operator carries on business in Australia or an external territory. So the business can be outside of Australia. And obviously GDPR is the inverse. So if you've got citizens working in Australia, organizations have to comply with that.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. Glad you got that up. All right. I would need another 3 screens. All right. Should we keep going?
Yes, let's continue.
Okay. Measurement and monitoring. Sorry, Tim, we're almost there. So early on, I say early on, as in previous weeks, you should have set some objectives. And so the first thing is you need to set objectives. I know that I put this here, but I think we talked about it previously. Here's some examples. Reduce the number of successful cyber incidents. That sounds like a pretty good objective. Minimize the time to detect cyber threats. We did talk about things like dwell time. increase the level of user awareness of phishing campaigns, and improve patch management. Anyone that's doing ISO will probably have done this. And if you're thinking about it, you will need to do something like this. And then how are you going to measure that? Well, not how you measure that. What is the measurement example? Not the how, sorry. This is the you know, what, how are you going to meet this objective? So wait a minute. My greater than's the wrong way around. My bad. See, I was half asleep when I did this. That was meant to be less than. That's a greater than, sorry. Less than, greater gator, right? Yeah. Well, less than one successful, let's pretend it says less than one successful cyber incident per month. That would be a good example. Dwell time reduction to, well, that was the right way around. Dwell time reduction to less than 7 days. Less than 1% phishing test failure. And patches meet KPIs across, that was meant to, oh, that's right, greater than 95% of systems. So that is, I mean, those are some examples, but you come up with those own examples. So yeah, that's just some ways to do that. And how would you do that? Well, that's interesting as well. There are different ways to measure that. So for example, things like cyber incidents per month and dwell time reduction. I mean, that's obviously the ability to detect them, and then you'd have to respond to that. And then you would have to say, okay, well, this attack was not successful. And that would be something that you would measure as a metric. Same with dwell time. If there were an attack and you detected it within 5 days using your systems, then that would fall within that objective. Phishing tests, and Tim could talk about that in a little bit, I guess, but you know, things like phishing tests, I think are pretty straightforward to measure. A lot of the platforms will do that. I think he would do that as part of one of, you know, the engagements that they do for an external type one. Have I gone blurry? Yeah, sorry. It's not a filter. Patches meeting KPIs, that can be a little bit more tricky. I actually had to do a report like that every month. That was a bit tougher. And so KPIs being, that was against the ACSC's guidance, you know, the sort of 48 hours for extreme, down to the, was it 40 hours for extreme, and then 7 days for, was it critical, 14 for medium, and then lows were like 30 and that. So being able to sort of do that was a bit tricky, but did get there. But you know, boards do like to see that as well. So you said you're patching is really important. You know, you're patching everything. And funnily enough, the first time that that I got this report, turned out it was, and it was weird because like I think using SCCM at the time, it was like, yeah, all your patches are up to date. Turns out, yeah, not really. So I don't know, it was like missing systems, just very odd. So that ended up being another project to uplift that to something that would actually update stuff and show all the patches. Some weirdness going on there. And then ways to measure, I mean, there's external and internal ways to measure. Internal, so internal audit, so doing an audit of all the sort of, you know, controls and audit of the systems. Doing periodic reviews, so reviewing logs, reviewing, you know, user rights, all sorts of ways to do that. And then there might be internal reporting from specific platforms. So if you've got like a vulnerability management system, like, you know, a Rapid7, Qualys, OpenVAS, whatever, Nessus, Tenable, then, you know, that's going to have reporting. If you've got a SIEM, that might have some reporting. If you've got like a XDR system, that might have some reporting. DLP has reporting. So, you know, taking that information and using those measurements will help. And then here we go. External security testing and pen testing. I think I want to pause there. So I don't know. I've got a slide. So sorry, security testing, pen testing, then external audit, and then certification and assurances. I'm going to go to this slide because this is the one that I was talking about, where, and Tim, sorry, I should have asked you what colors you wanted, because yeah, I only had the 3, but I think it'd be really good to give everyone a bit of an overview on some of this, and then maybe we could pause and some folks can ask some questions on this stuff.
Cool. Oh, I can't see it at the moment. It's got these little windows everywhere.
I can just read the question. So the first one is security testing or ethical hacking, and same thing, right?
Yeah.
Versus penetration testing. I think that's one that pops up a lot, and a lot of folks, you know, the definitions seem a bit ambiguous, but is there a clear difference between sort of ethical hacking and pen testing?
I mean, I think it's more confusing wrapping security testing in front of ethical hacking, but
Can I tell you why that is?
Sorry?
Can I tell you why that is?
Go on then.
Why? Okay. So for anyone that I guess, well, I think you all know, I wrote a thesis, and my thesis was really focused on ethical hacking. And I think some of and obviously when you do a thesis, it goes to examiners, and examiners like, I guess, provide, you know, they'll either I guess accept your paper as it is, or they'll provide feedback, and you've got to go and sort stuff out. And so well, some of the feedback that I got was that so I had two out of 3 approvals first time round. So yay, 66.666666%. And then I had one examiner say that they, and I'm not going to say who the person is, but they're very, and I know who they are. And so a very well respected person that's been in the field for many years, said that the term ethical hacking has, and I know that we all kind of know it as that, you know, there's books sort of like ethical hacker and things like that, but it has negative sort of connotations and perceptions around it because it uses the word hacking. And I know that's sort of the ethical bit meant to kind of cancel that out. But that's why. So the reason for that is because it's to not make it sound like it's glorifying hacking. I think. Right away.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd probably split it out. So security testing, we often see that. Yeah, I mean, people use these terms interchangeably, and at the end of the day, if you're a consultant, like I am, and the customer calls it something, so long as it's not massively wrong, you generally just go with it. It's just in the scope that you define on how you're going to do something, you explain what you're actually going to do. And usually that's good enough. If someone did something like penetration testing or red teaming, it would probably be enough of a difference that I'd have to say, hey, like, sorry, that's quite different. But yeah, so certainly security testing, ethical hacking, penetration testing, very similar. Sometimes penetration testing, people actually just want a code review. That's not really pen testing. That's, you know, if you're looking at code and trying to find vulnerability, it's something very different. If you're looking at a configuration review, same thing. Is that pen testing? Not really, but sometimes just gets chucked in that basket. So I wouldn't stress too much about these things. If you're applying for roles, there's a good chance that when they say pen tester, you could be looking at firewall configs all the way through to doing red teaming. So probably best just to ask. For red teaming, so red teaming is obviously something that came from the military back in the day, when like from actual kinetic warfare. So that actually, you know, they'd take a unit and they'd split it up, and then they'd have them go head to head. And so you'd have the red team, which would be the offensive team, and the blue team, the defending team. And, you know, generally the blue team would be defending something, the red team would be trying to reach that objective, that goal. So nothing's really changed these days. The blue team is defending the corporate network or some sort of critical business system, service, critical function, and the red team is generally a consultancy, sometimes an internal team that is doing the same thing. They're trying to reach that objective to do something. Red teaming these days, we're trying to shift people across to using terms like adversary attack simulation. Red teaming tends to be something where if someone comes to us and asks for a red team, we'll ask a lot of questions to make sure they know what they're talking about. One of the things I'll ask is, what are you trying to achieve? And if they say, oh, look, we just want to know if you can compromise the corporate network. So, okay, cool. Like, do you want us to do it a particular way? And they say, oh yeah, we want you to social engineer, or like there's this threat, or we're worried about ransomware, or whatever it is. And so it starts to become a very specific threat-based conversation. So they're actually more interested in understanding if a particular threat can occur. And so you start moving down the adversary attack simulation. So they might say, well, actually, I think that, you know, a ransomware actor would, you know, compromise our network, and we're worried about encryption of all our sensitive things. Okay, cool. Like, how about we just do that? Like, we'll emulate that threat end to end. So we end up doing that. And again, that suddenly becomes adversary attack simulation. So trying to kind of move away from just calling it plain red teaming. When people say red teaming, I just generally think of get in any way you can. And it used to be that like the board or the CISO, or even before there was CISOs, you know, someone would say like, can you get in? Like, you know, we've spent all this money on pen testing, we've spent all this money on controls, but if someone could just do anything, could they get in? And then away we'd go and we'd try any way to get in, including back then physically, you know, tailgating people through the door to put, you know, wireless routers under the desk. Now we've got Raspberry Pis, it's a bit more fun. But these days we even split out red teaming, at least my organization, NCC Group, and a few in Europe. We differentiate between red teaming and black teaming, where black teaming's physical and red teaming's cyber. And just because they're so different. And so, yeah, like it really kind of like, can you get in anyway, or is it, you know, aligned to a threat? Blue teaming, people say blue teaming. I don't actually know what blue teaming is. Well, I have never done a blue team, and you know, so that it's kind of lost on me. We have some salespeople in the organization here that sometimes use that term, and I'm like, well, so what are we doing? And they generally end up describing a purple team to me. The purple teaming is when the red team, obviously, and the blue team mix colors. Colors of the rainbow, obviously, back in primary colors, and when you're mixing colors as a kid, you get purple. And that's effectively what it is. You got the red team and the blue team collaboratively working together. So, you know, as opposed to a red team where we're trying to stay stealthy and really assess the organization's detection and response, not just can we get in, but, you know, if, you know, not if, but when. And when we do get in, how long did it take you to detect us? How long did it take you to respond to us when you detected us? So quite different, because, you know, the whole thing is stealthy. And purple teaming is overt, and you're collaboratively working with the defensive team, the blue team, to do different attacks and make sure that they can actually detect them. Right? So you're not so much worried about finding vulnerabilities, that's pen testing. Purple teaming is about doing an attack and making sure that there's detection logic. Is the time to detection appropriate? Is the quality of detection appropriate? Some salespeople that I've seen, they'll say that purple teaming exercises response as well, or assesses response as well. I'm slightly uncomfortable with that, because a lot of the time when you're doing a purple teaming, you're not really assessing the response of an organization, particularly from an incident response perspective. Because, you know, when there's a detection, because you're overtly or collaboratively working with the defensive team, because they know that you're there, you're not really testing their response because they know that you're there. That's what red teaming is for. Although some vendors, I won't name names, will tell you that, you know, if you buy our product and you do automated purple teaming, you're testing detection and response. If you are testing response, you're testing the little r response, which is the people sitting in the SOC looking at the alerts on the screen and going, oh yeah, I saw it, but I knew you were about to do it, but I saw it. So yeah, yes, but not really, not in my opinion. But yeah, is that a good description of all the things?
That's fantastic. I guess the question is, you know, is there one of those, well, let's talk about red and purple, that is more effective than like each other? Like, is one more effective versus less effective, or they have specifically different use cases?
Yeah, definitely different. They're both effective at the areas that they focus on. So red teaming is generally better at detection and response, and really helping an organization understand if someone could get in anyway, or, you know, is my prevention, detection, response adequate for a particular threat? So the adversary attack simulation, yeah. So and across people, process, and technology, right? You've probably heard that term thrown around all the time, but it is really important, because people and process is where a lot of organizations fall down. They can spend billions of dollars. No one spends billions of dollars. They spend, they can spend hundreds of thousands, millions even, on all the pen testing and all the controls and all the gadgets. Red teamer comes along and just gets, and it happens every day, and we do it all the time. And then, you know, there's this kind of like denial, and then acceptance, and then, you know, and then it is just one of those things where people are a weak link for a lot of organizations. Processes fall apart, and it's just not the kind of thing that you sometimes find in pen testing because of the way things are scoped. And there's a lot of change environment, you know. Pen testers like, you know, can have quite open scopes, and red teams can have quite restrictive scopes. But when both are done properly, they provide value in different ways. When you mix in purple, because you're collaboratively working with the team, you can't really test social engineering. So that people is mostly out the window, if not completely. Like, you can do phishing attacks, so you can kind of test that. But even then, because you're collaboratively working with the organization, there's kind of limits there. But in most cases, yeah. So once you purple team, like the people element is mostly out. Processes can absolutely test, but again, like I said earlier, like response isn't really a thing. So different purposes. What I tell customers is, obviously, I'll caveat that red teaming and adversary attack simulation, I try to kind of differentiate between the two. But certainly, if we're just talking generally, red teaming, I say, focuses people, process, technology, prevention, detection, response. And purple teaming focuses on detection and process and technology, if that helps. You can draw a nice, pretty kind of graph with the overlay of all the things, but yeah.
Fantastic. And one thing that I probably didn't mention and should have is that I have found, I'm sorry if this isn't a sales pitch for Tim, but I've found the getting one of these engagements done has been useful for two things. It's useful for identifying where you do have issues, and then for putting a business case together and using that as part of the justification, because you're saying, okay, we've had an independent organization come in, do this assessment, they've identified this is like critical, we need to do something about it. But then also, after it all goes through and it's all implemented in happy days, they come back and do another test, and then the finding's gone, as in it's been resolved. So it's both a way to help build and to identify what projects need to be done and to build a business case, but it's also, the second part of that is to validate the effectiveness of the controls that you have, which is kind of what was placed at the end here, because it was more around that. And yeah, sorry, Tim, I had you just sit there and wait for the first sort of hour, but it's more, but you were very, very helpful. I was reading through your answers, very good. You answered that one that popped back up last week, this week from last week, which about the pen testing stuff. But yeah, so there are multiple benefits to this. And look, that could be said as well about the other types of sort of assessments that we'll talk about in a second. But obviously, this type of assessment is very, very, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, but very technical and very in depth. Whereas like an audit is more of a, oh, did you do that? Yep, cool. And then maybe there's a screenshot of something. So, and that's not to say, hey, I've been an auditor. It's not to say that there's no value in that, because there absolutely is. But the pen tests will actually demonstrate more of a, no, there is a vulnerability and these guys exploited it, right? So I feel like that has a lot more kind of like sledgehammer power than, oh, you didn't do a user access review sort of thing. So I find that really useful. And by the way, I'm kind of curious now about your gold teaming, black teaming, pink
Yeah,
teaming.
so the black teaming is just physical. So it's almost identical to red teaming and often has like a cyber component. We just find it's easier because a lot of customers, especially in Australia, over in Europe, I think the market's a little bit more mature. They tend to kind of understand what they want. Definitely Australia's approved in the last 5 years, but customers will come asking for a red team and wanting to improve their cyber posture, trying to improve detection and response. And as a provider, we'll go in with a massive code, a big number, because, we're trying to improve their cyber. But, a competitor might go in with, a tenth of the price. But what the competitor's planning to do is just tailgate someone in and plug that router, that Raspberry Pi under the desk, sit in the cafe or even over 3G, and then try and hack the internal network. Now, if you're an organization, you're worried about ransomware, like in Australia, Singapore, where physical threats, small island, big island, they're not a big thing. Like you don't really see physical attacks. If you look in the news every day and look at the initial access vector for a lot of the ransomware cases, it is across some sort of network application security vulnerability, even human, but it's still cyber related. Very rare would you see in Singapore, Australia, that like someone's actually implemented ransomware the network through some sort of physical vector. So if someone comes to me and they say that they want a red team, I feel like I'm taking their money, and it's not fair on them if I then just do that, because it's cheap and very easy to do, and it's not providing much value. So really try to kind of take the person on a journey to understand, like, what actually are you trying to do? Are you trying to tick a box that says you have to do a red team, in which case, not sure. But if you're actually trying to understand and improve detection and response to the threat you should be most concerned about, then certainly you want to be doing adversary attack simulation, which again why I'm trying to push people away from red teaming as a term. But yes, like a cyber red team, like maybe, yeah. It doesn't mean that black teaming is not a thing. We've got an amazing black team both here and in a couple of other parts of the world. Black teaming is a thing. Like nation state actors will target government institutions, critical infrastructure with physical threats. But for the most common organizations that should be worried more about ransomware and some sort of financial fraud, it's not going to be physical. And if it is, and someone's breaking into some of these organizations, most of it is petty theft. They're stealing a laptop. And while you might need to implement some sort of process to understand what was on the laptop, was it encrypted, was the encryption sufficient, was the password strong, all these sorts of things as part of your incident response to the stolen laptop or the lost laptop, it's nowhere near of the scale that should ransomware kind of like encrypt all the critical things and like potentially go bankrupt. So on a kind of threat metric, they're not even close to being equal. So trying to push people to red teaming and away from black teaming, for most organizations, I want to say like 95%, it is definitely something. Now, if you talk about defense contractors, defense, or any of these things, sure, that's a thing.
Great. Excellent. I've only got one slide left after this. So, oh, there you go. I was going to say, was there any more questions? But no. All right, then. So
I'm so sorry. I just tried to close the Q&A and it took the Q&A away from everybody. So we actually do have some more questions and I've brought them back.
Okay. So if you click that Q&A button again.
Yes, if everyone can just refrain from adding more questions because the Q&A is closed. So we'll get through the questions that we currently have and then finish up, and all further questions can be directed to the forums.
So do we want to read through a couple of these, and then I know Tim's typing the answer to the first one, but we could just talk through it.
Yeah, let's go to this second question down. Typically, cybersecurity incidents are very different from the exercises that the red, purple, and blue teams do. How to measure the effectiveness of this type of test? I think this is kind of what you two have just covered. I suppose, is there a particular way to measure that effectiveness versus the effectiveness of other strategies?
Sorry, I was was reading the question in the other chat. So what was, I missed it.
The question was, is there a way to measure the effectiveness of the color teaming exercises versus other types of tests?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can measure it just based on what it finds and the success against the objective. So if you're kind of emulating an actor, so maybe you're emulating a ransomware actor, so you kind of doing the same techniques that they would do from left to right, so from initial access to actions on objectives, then depending how successful the team is end to end, you could say that, you know, you could measure it just based on that alone. Yeah, so yeah. Yes. Cool.
Great. And continuing on the color teaming theme, should color teaming be preceded by some sort of tabletop exercises or scenario development?
Yeah, so that's the gold teaming. So the gold teaming is that tabletop exercise. The gold color comes, if you're trying to work out where it's come from, because by the way, I don't buy into all the colors, you know, me trying to shift across to other terms, but this is something that it's an industry thing, not something that I've done. So please don't point fingers. But the gold team comes from execs being like the gold part, the gold standard of the company. So in any case, working with that team specifically, you can imagine that like the red teaming, the black teaming, the purple teaming, in most cases you're dealing with SOCs, NOCs, and just security folk, incident responders. So when you do a tabletop exercise, you're generally working with a crisis management team or an incident response team, and then executives, so C-suite, and then the board. So when you do a tabletop exercise, generally these days we would simulate what we call a playbook or a threat. So a playbook is something that an incident response plan or an incident response playbook, something organization would have that tells them how to handle a threat. So a mature organization has this. Certain frameworks and kind of regulations tell organizations they should have these things. And so, you know, they might have a playbook for ransomware, and the playbook might focus on critical infrastructure within their organization that suffers from ransomware. You know, how do we recover? How do we deal with the ransomware? And so should it happen, rather than everyone running around with their hair on fire, hands in the air, they just go, oh, someone get the playbook, let's go through it. Of course, it's encrypted. No, just joking. You know, they're told to print it off. But anyway, they grab the playbook and they start working through it. They very quickly realize that the playbook's out of date. You know, there's a new system in the back end, and you know, all these different things in the playbook just doesn't work. Or you know, that they never actually worked the playbook to understand if it was actually relevant. Someone put it together quickly to, you know, for a regulation. All these sorts of things kind of happen, and generally, it's just best to exercise the playbook in a tabletop exercise, and going through it with a company like us, or you know, so either an incident response team or a red team, or you know, even GRC consultants can work the crisis management team to help them understand where the gaps are, how they can improve against the threat that we're emulating. So we become the threat, and we kind of hypothetically across a boardroom table or in a PowerPoint these days, we'll take them through it, and they'll go, oh, okay, I didn't think of that. And, you know, there'll be a guy in the corner that is supposed to be, you know, the lead on the incident, but actually turns out that person's communication skills aren't the best. So, you know, maybe off the back end of it, they go, well, you know, George, you know, his communication skills are amazing. Maybe he should be, you know, the virtual lead on these incidents. And so they might do a little shift of roles and responsibilities. And that's, you know, that's the majority of the kind of goal teaming at the crisis management team level. Very technical crisis management, very technical tabletop exercises, like we'll actually exercise the incident response team. So we're trying to make them very technical. Sometimes we even mix up red teaming and gold teaming so that they've got real indicators of compromise or attack on the network to work through while we run them through a tabletop. So a blend of that. If we're dealing with the board, who love to do these now as well, after these big mega incidents, these mega breaches, where the board is responsible these days, and people lose jobs and get fined, etc. So they want to go through them too as well. So these days we will run board members through what it would look like for them to help them understand the decisions that they would need to make. Does that make sense?
Yeah, great, wonderful. All right, I'm going to quickly jump to my last slide, and if we've got time, we can get back to questions.
Thank you.
Oh, second last slide. Sorry, this is a bit quick anyway. So certification and assurance. So still talking about the external stuff, and we have talked about ISO to death. So I think we all know what that is now, if we didn't before. But getting an external organization to assess, audit, and attest to compliance with the ISO 27001 standard would demonstrate, I guess that there are, risk management has been implemented, and that there's been thought put into the development of a security program. And so, once again, going back to the sort of the ethical hacking / testing or security testing piece, that will often also be a piece of 27001 ISMS, so that would be in there. The other sort of three types of reports worth talking about are the SOC reports. So these are all kind of audit driven versus the sort of previous topic. So SOC 2 type 1, SOC 2 type 2, and SOC 3. And so SOC 2 reports or SOC reports are developed by the AICPA, American Institute Chartered, I can't remember, it's an accounting thing, right? But it describes criteria for controlling, I guess, and managing customer information. And it's based on sort of 5 principles that are provided to provide trusted services. And so that's things around availability, around privacy, around security, confidentiality, and processing integrity. And so, you see a lot of that when we talk about things like financial systems and things and so forth, hence like processing integrity. And a SOC 2 type 2 report is the one that would demonstrate, I guess, operational effectiveness. And so that is typically, well, it's not typically, it is taken over a period of time. So a SOC 2 type 2 report is going to be a over the time report. So an auditor will come in several times to see how a control is operating and make sure it's operating effectively, versus a SOC type 1, which is a point in time snapshot. A type 2 report often will require an NDA to be signed in order to get that, because there's typically going to be some confidential and sensitive information in there. A SOC 3 report is more of a general report that kind of provides a kind of high level, I guess, statement that they meet the requirements of the SOC, that they meet the SOC requirements, but it doesn't contain that level of detail. So if you're going to get one, SOC 2 type 2 is the best one. If you're going to ask for one, SOC 2 type 2 is the best one to ask for, but it usually does come with that caveat of you must sign an NDA first. Having said that, some vendors like like Microsoft and Amazon, you can get it from the trust center. Yes, you do still have to agree to not, share it and distribute it, but the process is pretty straightforward. Cool. And then finally, reporting. So we talked about all these bits and pieces and all these bits of kind of information, these measurements and these objectives, just some useful things for reporting that I have over. I wish I had a report that I could just pop up in here that wasn't full of confidential information. But some things that boards like to look at. I find boards like to look at these things. And you might be reporting these to senior management to demonstrate the return on investment or whatnot. And I also, so the first thing is, what does our risk profile look like before and after? So what did it look like before? And now that we've, done all this stuff, what does it look like now? So what is that shift? So that's something that, boards like to see. And then how did our investments change that risk profile? So obviously link that back. So we did these projects, and that could be in a heat map, could be in, donut charts, whatever you like. But I find that really, really useful. Talking about auditors, what are the audit findings and what are we doing about it? I think one thing that's really clear as well about auditing is I find sometimes auditors aren't very pragmatic and take more of a cookie cutter approach depending on how good the auditor is. So it's important to identify when that may have happened, because if that may have happened, you may need to go and argue with the auditor, or you may need to explain that you don't agree with this and that you're working with the auditor to sort of deal with it, or that you accept it because it's not right, and put in the response that you don't agree with it. What incidents have occurred and what is the impact and what have you learned? So if there was an incident, did you just the cyber response plan have to get activated, or was it captured before that because you've got some investment that you've made and some project that's allowed you to quickly detect that? What is the impact? And is the impact nothing because we've been able to detect it and stop it? And I think the last thing is avoiding the tech jargon. So try not to put technical stuff into the report unless the audience are going to understand it. Otherwise, you are going to either A, have them not understand it, or B, spend a lot of time trying to explain it, or they'll just kind of zone out because it's way too much detail. Talk about reporting. One thing I did once when I was a job that I was at was I had this dynamic dashboard. We go into the system and it pulled things up like the patch compliance, as I said, against the ACSC timelines. It had things like DLP incidents. But the interesting thing was the dashboard was there for 2 years. It used it for 2 years, but not one exec logged in ever to look at that dashboard. It's not that I didn't see it. What ended up happening was I just had to print it and stick it into the board pack. So I just went to the browser, got the report, went export to PDF, hit print, and then, put it in the board pack. So I'm not saying don't do it, but don't be like upset if you have this fantastic dashboard that no execs use, because that was me. But that was it. Fantastic. Sorry, blew that last one there, but are we good? All the questions done? Is that it?
The questions are done. Massive thanks to Tim for just consistently answering questions via typing throughout the entire webinar. I've never seen so many questions get answered in one of our webinars before. Maybe we should always have 2 experts on hand for this.
Maybe that's one of our lessons learned.
Maybe it is, yeah. It should go into our reporting minus the technical jargon.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much to Tim and George. It was a very special treat to have not 1 but 2 experts joining us today. And thank you very much to all of our participants. So if the fire in your belly has been ignited by your newfound passion for cyber defense and you're interested in studying a full-length course, feel free to have a look at what you might be eligible for in the array of courses that IT Masters and CSU offer. You can check those out at itmasters.edu.au or submit an eligibility assessment at eligibility.itmasters.edu.au. Lily will pop the details of that in the chat. Massive thanks as well to Lily Nguyen, who has been working away in the background, making sure everything runs smoothly on the back end. As always, yes, George is one of our fantastic IT Masters mentors, and maybe Tim will be in the future if he's enjoyed this experience particularly. Then, who knows? Maybe there'll be a course or a short course with him in the future. Sorry to dob you in there, Tim. I have no idea how you feel about that. But I particularly enjoyed listening to the 2 of you interact and answer questions. The exam, for those who are waiting on the edge of their seats about the exam details, as I said earlier, the exam will be up on Monday on learn.itmasters.edu.au, which is also where you can find all of the recordings, slides, readings, other information for all 4 weeks of this short course. That exam will be open on Monday. There is no closing date. There's no date by which you have to complete it. Complete at your leisure. It is a 1-hour multiple choice exam that is open book. We can't stop you from opening your book, so we're not going to try. And the certificates for that exam will be available next Friday. if you're interested in further IT Masters short courses, there are many recorded on our website as well. And if you're interested in attaining some course credit, there is a way that you can do that, which is by completing and passing 3 of the ITM and CSU short courses for free, which counts as a credit towards 1 subject in a full-length graduate certificate or master's degree with us. Thank you once again to everybody. Thank you to George for the last 4 weeks. Thank you to Tim for this week. Thank you to Lily for all 4 weeks as well. And I'm going to go ahead and thank myself because I can. And that will conclude our 4-week webinar. Thank you, everybody. And hopefully we will see you in one of our next ones. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night once again. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. See you later. Thanks, George.
Bye. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.